It's really a pleasure to have folks from the Nisqually Indian tribe here. We have David Troutt, Christopher Ellings, and Ashley Von Essen. And David, I'm going to turn it over to you if you want to give a little introduction to this talk we're about to hear.
I will. Thank you, John, my friend. Good to see you and hear your voice.
Good. Same, Dave.
Yeah, so we're excited to be here to have the opportunity to talk to you all about what we've been doing in the Nisqually over the last few decades. And Chris is going to go through a pretty amazing presentation that for us in the Nisqually is our beacon of hope. And it really pays off that when you can see the results of your work making a difference in the fish and in the communities, it's pretty remarkable. And the story you're going to hear is really a story of perseverance and patience and promise and survival, resiliency, and connections. Most of all, I think the story is about partnerships and working together over long periods of time with a common vision to get things done. These watershed councils from the Nisqually to the Skagit to the Nooksack out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca are all critically important, and the work that we all do is invaluable in making a difference. Sometimes it's hard to see that difference on a day-to-day basis, but it's there, and I know you all see it, and we're going to share what we've seen in the Nisqually, which I think is a pretty remarkable story. And so Bill Ruckelshaus, one of our leaders at the Salmon Recovery Council years ago, used to say that we had to stay everlasting at it. And the story you're going to hear from us is really a good example of staying everlasting at it and giving the fish a chance to recover. And so I'm excited to have my team here and to share this with you. And after the presentation, we'll be here and available to answer questions.
Thank you for having us. Via the magic of the interwebs, we're here from Nisqually Watershed. And as David mentioned, this really is a story. Of course, it has a base in the science of restoration. It also has a base in the culture of the Nisqually people. And for some of us, we've had the privilege of working on this stuff for decades now. And to see things actually start to happen has been really amazing. In terms of Chinook lifespan, it's been about 5 generations of Chinook since they were listed under the ESA as threatened. That's really not a long time. And so I think with patience and monitoring, we can actually see some of the results of all the hard work that we've been putting in the Nisqually, and I know that has been happening in the Skagit and other watersheds as well. So the Nisqually is a pretty small watershed as far as Chinook watersheds go, especially compared with the mighty Skagit and the Columbia and others. But it drains a really diverse landscape from over 14,000 feet on the glaciers of Mount Rainier down to the Puget Sound lowland prairie ecosystems, which are incredibly unique. And it's this uniqueness of the landscape, the unique hydrology of the system, that has really driven the salmon community in the Nisqually to have diverse run timing and have diverse life history throughout the different species. And of course, it's the home of the Nisqually Indian tribe. For those of us who've been working there for a long time, we know that salmon are pivotal to every important moment in a tribal member's life, from their birth to birthdays, to weddings, to funerals, and all celebrations. Salmon are a part of that celebration of life and part of how you commemorate pivotal moments in your life. And so it's much more than just a thing you catch and eat. It truly is a spiritual connection to the river, to a way of life that has existed for thousands of years. And like many watersheds throughout Puget Sound, the list of our stock status going through our different species and stocks within the Nisqually probably rings true and is a similar throughout Puget Sound, with some stocks that have been extirpated, gone completely, like our spring Chinook, our fall Chinook that we presumed was extirpated, our winter steelhead that are all wild and unique are depressed, our winter chum that the Nisqually people depend on every winter and are the latest returning chum on the Pacific Rim are declining, and on and on and on. those of us who work in this field know that it always feels like you're pushing an incredibly large boulder up the hill, and you just keep taking baby steps, and sometimes you slide back, and it seems so daunting when you see these declining trends year after year after year. And so what started this out? Well, in the Nisqually, just like so many of our watersheds, it really starts with the transition from an economy within the Northwest that was based on the tides and the seasons and the runs of fish and the availability of clams and the migration of our game animals, to an economy based on industry and the changing the landscape to match that industry and support that industry. This is a picture of Chinese immigrant laborers that were here after the building of the transcontinental railroads, being employed to build the over 5 mile long Brown Farm dike on the Nisqually River, the most extensive diking system that blocked off the Nisqually estuary. And then as the economy increased and the population increase of the Northwest, of course, we built transportation corridors all over the place, from rail lines through the nearshore to freeways across our systems. And these were built trying to get from A to B as fast as possible without a consideration for the way rivers function and the way the ecosystems function that support salmon. And then, of course, industrial logging, and really the invention of the steam engine and power tools really increased the pace of logging on a scale that was unseen, and really resulted in a complete change in the dynamics of our watersheds, from systems that had disturbances like fires and landslides that were few but in very large magnitude, to disturbances that happen all the time, of a short magnitude, but resulted in a fundamental change to the sediment loading and wood loading and temperature regimes and flow regimes of our systems. And then, of course, hydropower. This can be echoed across the different watersheds in Puget Sound, as the watersheds became kind of energy colonies for the budding urban infrastructures. And even if these dams did not actually block fish passage, they totally changed the way that water, sediment, wood, and all those other things flowed through the system, and completely changed the way the hydrograph functions. And that was those hydrographs and that way that the seasonal water patterns operated that allowed for the local adaptation of these fish that were timed to take advantage of different flows. So hydropower totally changed that. And then, of course, the death by 1,000 cuts from well-intentioned landowners like this one that was beautifying their property for their daughter's wedding. This happens all throughout our watersheds on small tributaries where people just act out of ignorance, really, for how the system supports salmon and what salmon need. And then, of course, we have even congressional legislation that for the environmental communities were successes, like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but were done in such a way that they narrowly interpreted how the ecosystem functions, and were so focused on individual species that they cared about, they ignored the way the people interacted with those animals and the way those animals interacted on a larger system. For example, these are sea lions, stellar sea lions, and California sea lions off the mouth of the Nisqually River. And these sea lions are not critical to how these populations persist. They're basically teenage males that have been kicked out and are just kind of wandering around feeding on fish. And if this happened when the Nisqually people were actively being able to manage, this would have been a boon to the Nisqually people and helped for housing and for food and resources. But these sea lions would never have been able to actually co-opt the entire mouth of the river and decimate our winter chum salmon. And then with the industrialization of our watersheds, of course, and the decline of wild salmon populations, it wasn't that people didn't want salmon anymore. People definitely love salmon. And so that's when the really large-scale hatchery production began. And with the hatchery production, I like to call it the Johnny Appleseed era, because there was no recognition for uniqueness. There was no recognition for local adaptation. And so eggs and fish were brought over from everywhere and kind of just willy-nilly used in different hatcheries. If we can make salmon in our hatcheries and we don't need wild salmon to spawn in the rivers, then we really don't need to worry about wild salmon escaping our fisheries as well. In South Sound, before the Bolt decision, the entire South Sound was just declared a hatchery wipeout zone for Chinook and coho salmon. And there was no management for actual escapement. It was a large purse steining, much larger than this. This is the only picture I could find off the internet. But it was a big purse steining effort that would just really decimate the populations. And it was without regard for any kind of escapement back to the rivers. And it was really the Bolt decision that reaffirmed the tribe's co-management authority that started to establish actually run sizes back to rivers and really re-recognized the importance of getting fish back to the spawning grounds to perpetuate themselves. With all these stresses caused throughout Puget Sound, of course, it resulted in the listing of Puget Sound Chinook under the Endangered Species Act in 1999. The Nisqually, we put out a Chinook recovery plan in 2001. It was the first one put out, and it was later adopted as a chapter in the official plan by NOAA for Puget Sound Chinook recovery. And the real fundamental piece of our recovery plan was that our wild Nisqually Chinook, our native local Nisqually Chinook that had evolved to take advantage of the Nisqually's unique landscape and its unique hydrology, was extirpated for many reasons, and including all those I mentioned before, the commercial fisheries, the hydropower operations in the Nisqually used to dry up entire sections of the river. And the long-term hatchery production in the river was significant, and using non-local Chinook, primarily from the Green River system. There was some early genetics work done as part of the Puget Sound Chinook listing, and it found that all the Chinook that were sampled, at least, were from that Green River hatchery population. So really our fundamental driver in our plan was to really try to rewild, if you will, our hatchery population and try to get that to get back on the spawning grounds, get eggs in the gravel. And so that's what we started doing. And the first thing towards rebuilding, this is a table of the different recovery phases that our plan captured. And the first recovery phase was to rebuild this population that we had lost with the population we had, and that's the Green River hatchery stock. And so the first thing we needed to do was address the habitat. Get the home fixed, get the watershed fixed, get the hydrology fixed, get the fundamental ecosystem functions fixed to where it can support a population of Chinook. And then we can work on kind of the stock management stuff as we go to get fish up there spawning and take it from there. So within our Chinook recovery plan, we had a slew of different habitat actions that included everything from a community forest up in the headwaters to work in the Nisqually Delta. We, as a legacy from Billy Frank Jr. about working with our neighbors and working with the people that can make a difference, we embrace all of our partners, and it's always been a partner-led effort, with the tribe setting the priorities and the recovery plans and really housing the recovery plans and managing our lead entity process, but working with a slew of different nonprofits and local government partners. And it's resulted in some pretty amazing work in such a small watershed. We've recovered over 900 acres, almost 1,000 acres of estuary habitat, and continue to work on the estuary. This was, at the time, the largest estuary restoration project in Puget Sound. And this is all of us gathering for the first tide coming in. And it was one of those moments that I'll always remember my entire life. people got pretty emotional. It was a really cool moment. People kept a lot of like mud and stuff from the day. I didn't. I just kept pictures, and stories of people keeping mud. But it was a wonderful, wonderful moment, and all of the research that we've done, in part actually with a lot of the work that researchers in the Skagit on estuary has shown that this is one of the key things that you can do to bring Chinook back, and it's proven itself. So now you can look out on the Nisqually Delta, and it's still recovering from over 100 plus years of being cut off from the tides. But now we have almost 90% of our delta has been recovered, with even more coming on the way as I-5, Interstate 5, gets put up on pilings within the next decade or so. And then in some of our tributaries where we've had historic ditching, as you can see here, this is Ohop Creek, to prevent flooding for farmers. We've come in and worked with the local landowners and bought properties where they've been willing sellers. We've bought easements from people that wanted to stay on their property, and we've worked to re-channelize our tributaries, where this is a ditch that Ohop Creek was in for over 100 years, and then we went back and actually recreated its historic geometry and then put the creek back in to this channel. And we've been doing this up and down this valley, and it's showing a lot of promise. We get a lot of fish now spawning in there and rearing, and beavers are moving in, and it's really working great. Perhaps the most important thing we've done is recognize that the Nisqually does have some incredibly high functioning habitat that still exists. And so the first and foremost in our recovery efforts was to prioritize protecting the main stem Nisqually River, which is really the heart of all the salmon, the needs for all the salmon. And so we've been on a very aggressive protection campaign, understanding that, regulations come and go, the stewardship of landowners can come and go, but protection is kind of the most important thing. And so we've protected nearly 80%, about 79% of the entire main stem, and it is in protected status, and we continue to keep working on that, just knowing that, we're sandwiched between Tacoma and Olympia in Thurston County and Pierce County, in two incredibly fast growing areas. And we've managed to hold off the kind of rural sprawl that's associated with this growth because of our protection efforts. And so it's just so important. And the Nisqually, in fact, is the line between the two counties that has incredibly amount of growth pressures. But because of the protection efforts, I mean, you can float whole sections of the Nisqually River and you feel like you're out on the Olympic Peninsula or Southeast Alaska somewhere. It truly is remarkable just how we've been able to maintain the high level of habitat despite the population pressures that have been happening over the last couple of decades. And then where we've seen legacy effects from the logging in the past, where on the Michelle River, which is our kind of classic Cascade drainage coming off the Cascade Mountains, the wood loading is so low because the wood was actively removed from the channel. There were splash dams on the Michelle River. And for those of you who don't know what splash dams are, it's when dams were built out of logs in the river to impound sections of the Michelle River to float additional logs behind that impoundment. And those impoundments were then blown to rush the logs down to the main stem river in one big flood. So the logs could keep going down the main Nisqually and out to Puget Sound to be shipped off. This totally decimated the spawning gravels and the diversity of habitats within the Michelle River. And so we've been going throughout the Michelle and putting these engineered log jams in, which now really comprise the only, pool habitat and riffle pool type habitat within the system. And knowing that this isn't sustainable to continue to have to build these log jams, which have about a 20-year lifespan all the time, that we really need to address the root cause. And that was to go up into our timber, our forest lands, and really start to buy the critical forest lands to incorporate into the Nisqually Community Forest effort. And the Nisqually Community Forest, it's not a land trust. It actually is a working forest where we are going to log, we are going to support local timber mills and local jobs, and we are doing that now. But it has a different, it doesn't operate with a bottom line like a private timberland. It operates through ecosystem-based management. And so we're trying to raise the average age of the stands to over 80 years, at which time our modeling suggests that you start to see vast improvements to the ecosystem, both in water quantity, water quality, wood loading, sediment, and that kind of thing. And so we're kind of taking back the management of the forest lands while still supporting our local economies. This is the Nisqually Salmon Recovery Crew album cover that we're dropping some hits soon. Now, this is recognizing that our fish swim in Puget Sound too, and the ability to recovery to truly happen is also going to be dependent on how we restore and recover Puget Sound. And so we work throughout Puget Sound, really, from policy level things throughout the region to actually helping our partners do restoration within the nearshore environment. And this is my crew going out to McNeil Island, which is Washington State's Alcatraz. It now only holds about 30 high-level sexual offenders, but the rest of the island is an incredibly still unpopulated and still has decades and decades of shoreline alterations that we've been working with our partners at the state WDFW and Washington Department of Natural Resources to do a bunch of restoration. And, you know, it's an incredible story. Here's a site of a pocket estuary that we restored that was all impounded by a road. We're doing a lot of shoreline plantings. And it's a great kind of side story because a lot of these guys are all Nisqually tribal members that are on our crew. They had uncles and relatives and others who were jailed on this island during the fish wars. When their relatives were exercising their treaty right and being hauled off by the state Department of Fisheries, they were dropped off here on this island. Billy Frank Jr. was dropped off here on this island. And so to get these tribal members back to this island, which sits right off of their river mouth and looks at them in the face every day and reminds them of this pain that happened, this generational trauma, to get these guys out there to heal the land and do restoration is really one of the most important things that I've ever been a part of, I think, in my career. And it's been really incredible. The first part of our rebuilding effort to restore the ecosystem conditions to support salmon has really gone remarkably well, even given, you know, tight purse strings and never having enough money to do everything we want. We've made some incredible strides. And so now we're kind of moved over to the stock management piece. Like, okay, we've gotten this river to be in much better shape than it's been in the last 100 years. And let's start to get some eggs in the gravel and really jumpstart this recovery effort. And so we started to take surplus hatchery fish from our hatcheries, and we would only take the bright ones and mark them, get genetics off of them, and then truck them into the spawning areas on the Nisqually. And this was all a way to just, hey, let's get eggs in the gravel, jumpstart production, and then we'll put in, we'll take actions after that to minimize then the impact of domestication and hatcheries on future generations of these fish spawning in the wild. Every fish was tagged. We had genetics off of every fish. And so we were able to And part of this effort that we worked on a big planning effort with the state Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as NOAA Science Center, also included a really robust monitoring and adaptive management plan. And so every step that we took always had a monitoring component, and we were measuring kind of in real time this effort to see if we were actually achieving what we set out to do. And so as part of the supplementation effort of getting these fish up in the spawning grounds, we knew each individual we put up there, we had a genetic marker for. And so then when we had the smolts coming out and moving down the river, they'd get some would get captured in the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife out-migrant trap. And we could see if those fish that we put up there, they were actually producing offspring and to what extent. And if this was actually going to be a viable action moving forward and get us to having a locally adapted, sustainable run. And meanwhile, we knew we had to change the way we counted fish. We had escapement estimates methods. So the way you go and count the fish that have moved up to spawn naturally was all based on this hatchery run and hatchery rack return and where the hatchery fish went if they didn't go in the hatchery. And so we started a new method called a change in ratio based escapement method, which basically involved going out and catch and releasing using this tangle nets and other methods, drift fishing, to get a handle on what was marked and what was unmarked. And through some fancy math, you could come up with a total run size of your Chinook and then piece out which part of that run size actually went up into the gravel to spawn. And every fish we encountered with this method, we also took genetics from. So we knew all those parents that we had handled and went upriver. As we were doing the change in ratio method, we started seeing some really jaw-dropping, eye-opening things. And one was that after our fishery, our tribal fishery out lower in the river, after the hatcheries had gotten their fish back and were done spawning, we were seeing these big, bright Chinook coming back that were all wild, big adipose fins, and that they would just kind of keep coming all the way through where the hatcheries were done spawning. By early October, these fish kept coming through October and then through November and into December. And so we're like, what is going on here? So we started getting the first of our genetic samples back. And this is a plot that could make your eyes go cross and maybe give you a headache, but it's actually really simple. This is just clusters of things that are similar. The black dots are all the dots that we released that were part of our hatchery population. And we expected that if there was one population, one stock in this river, and it was our Green River derived stock that was in our hatchery that we were releasing into the wild, we would only have one cluster on this plot. And that cluster, these black dots of fish that we released, their offspring would be these little yellow dots on top of the black dots. And that's all that we would see. But instead, we see two clusters. And the largest cluster is this other one. And these fish actually make up the vast majority of the fish that are being caught as juveniles in the smolt trap. And you see way more juveniles per adult that we sampled. And we started going back to saying, wait, what are those adults that we sampled that are producing all those juveniles? And they look like these hogs, massive, big wild fish that are coming in later over a much longer period of time. And so we're like, wow, this is crazy. Like, are we already seeing the local adaptation happen in our river, or what are we seeing? So we've called these fish the local Nisqually stock. And when you look at above the hatcheries, above all the fisheries, they comprise more than 75%, almost 80% of the adult fish that we've sampled so far. And as this goes on, we'll actually, it's actually much even higher significance. This is still a artifact of some of the supplementation we did with the Green River population, which is this PSF, Puget Sound Falls. These fish, it's the blue bars. Again, don't worry about all the math and the numbers, but just know that like at any given age of these adults, so this is age 3 fish, the blue bars are significantly larger than the orange bars, meaning that this stock that we're calling local Nisqually is much significantly larger at a given age than its Green River derived counterpart, even if the Green River derived fish was naturally produced, not produced in the hatchery. And that also holds true for the age 4. These are age 4 fish. These are very large fish. They're very diverse and they're very productive. And these are the fish that would feed orcas. And we wondered, hey, like we would have to have some sort of record of these fish. And so our harvest team scoured their cupboards and drawers for any kind of samples they could find, and found a bunch of scales from the 80s. And even though and then we ran genetics on those scales, even though most of the scales were still from that Green River population, the Puget Sound Falls that were brought in as part of the hatchery population, we did see a few of these local Nisqually fish in the early 80s. And that really tied it all together for us. And then we ran the more genetic analyses, and sure enough, within the genetics of this population, it shows that at some point in the past, generations ago, it had gotten down to a very, very low population size. So this fish was very much on the verge of blinking out. In fact, we thought it was gone. But this is the historic Nisqually wild population. It got to a very low point of almost being extirpated. And since our work that really started with the bolt decision and changes in hydropower operations, through all the work that we've done through the habitat restoration work and stock management work, these fish are actually coming back to a degree that we can see them now, and we're catching them now. And we now estimate that there close to 2,000 of them coming back. And we're putting in a lot more monitoring efforts to really get a grasp of this. So all of a sudden, in a few short years of implementing the repopulation efforts of our rebuilding recovery phase, and through the monitoring and adaptive management, and finding that we still have our existing Nisqually wild population, and that population is rebounding, we instantly fast forward what we thought we'd be in our recovery phase, from a phase that we thought we would be in for 100 years, trying to rewild a domesticated hatchery stock, to now where we have our locally adapted Nisqually stock. And now it's about continuing the habitat work to support it, while also implementing hatchery measures and other things to ensure that we don't do it any additional harm, and that we allow this fish to come back. You know, I think we have so many takeaways from the story. Some of the big ones are that, you know, the habitat work is so crucial. And it really, we've seen this now with our steelhead as well, that went from a population, a large 10,000 fish run, down to just a couple hundred in the late 90s, is starting to rebound as well, and is hanging on largely because of our habitat work. And so we're seeing this time and again that you might not get back to these major abundances right away, but the habitat work is so crucial to weathering storms, weathering poor ocean conditions, holding on, making sure your populations are still viable to take advantage of conditions when they allow to really recover. And then the biggest thing, you know, one of the biggest things we learned too is that you can't undersell the importance of monitoring, evaluation, adaptive management, recognizing when you're wrong. As soon as we found these fish, we stopped that supplementation effort right away. Oh, no more of that. And so, but being able to change, adapt, monitor is huge in this field where we really are just playing with parts of the picture at all times, and we don't know everything, and it's not mechanistic. And so we need to maintain that flexibility in our management. But yeah, this has been a pretty amazing journey over the last 10 years or so, as we've really ramped this up. And you can see the grin on Renee's face here, holding the local Nisqually Chinook, and I think that's another piece, is the human component, the cultural component. It's so significant. And our fishermen went from and David has some other really amazing stories about this, but our fishermen went from just hearing bad news after bad news after bad news about their resource, about what they truly believe is their relatives, these fish. And then to be able to hear that they're not gone, their relatives are still coming back to the river, and they're coming back more and more and more, and that soon they'll be able to go out and catch them for first fish ceremonies. We'll be able to have CNS fisheries on them. And then in the future, as we implement more and more of these actions, that will be their fishery. They'll have a long fishery to be able to catch these fish and have them for weddings and have them for births. And that is a huge piece to everything we do, and a real driver. And to see the faces of our community members light up when they catch these fish and see these fish now and hear about them when we present it is really just amazing. And a part of the story I don't think we communicate enough as a community of people trying to bring these fish back. And so with that, I'm going to stop and open it up to questions.
Yeah, Jeff Fisher with City Light. So I'm curious with the locally adapted, and I live in Olympia, so I watched your guys' work on this estuary for some time, and kudos to y'all. I'm curious with the locally adapted Chinook that you're seeing rebound. It wasn't clear to me from the talk. So I have two questions. The genetics there are distinct from the Green River stock, right? And so this isn't your key objective of trying to rewild the hatchery stock, is kind of baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, right? I mean, essentially, right? Okay. So really interesting finding there. Is the rebound, have you done any stable isotope analysis of juveniles correlated with the opening up of the estuary and this locally adapted progenitor stock there? I think you see what I'm getting at. Is some of this rebound, there's a lot of fuzz there, but can you tie any of this rebound to the estuarian restoration work?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. We have done an extensive amount of estuarine research on the how Chinook are using the delta, and stable isotopes have been part of it. We have found that the fish that survive back to adult that we've sampled all have this estuarine check. Estuary rearing is a huge piece, a component of their life history. What we haven't done yet, and is on the docket, this is all so new, we haven't actually run the genetic stock identification on the fish that we sampled in the delta to affirm that they are the local Nisqually Chinook. My hypothesis is that they are, because we know from the smolt trap that the vast majority of fish that are being produced in the wild are from this stock. But we haven't confirmed that yet. But we have there is a very strong positive estuary response to our Chinook. And I mean, we've published like 24 papers on varying pieces of that. so far. But yeah, the estuary is definitely a key piece to this.
Excellent. I have one other question if nobody wants to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
So as some of you know, I formerly did work for NIMS for a fair number of years. And when I was there, one of the most distressing events that I had to sort of consult on was a fairly massive fish kill in Muck Creek. And you didn't really mention Muck Creek in terms of its restoration challenges. This event I'm referencing, I'm pretty sure I alerted the tribe, but was the Corps was responsible. They basically stoppered up the creek and assumed it was going to be dry for a restoration of a bridge. But anyway, Warren County kind of, and these were rainbow, but if you went through the historic records, at least down low in that creek, you were getting Chinook and a fair number of steelhead. Just the geology there is really, I'm not a geologist, it's very interesting. Doesn't hold a lot of, doesn't retain the water, I guess. Just really curious as to the tribe's perspective on that creek, because super productive, right? Low gradient, super productive, but a lot of risks in that system. So just wondering.
Yeah, Jeff. David, do you want me to take it quickly?
Sure.
And then you
Go ahead.
Yeah, from a recovery perspective, it's this pretty small stream for a Chinook. We're gonna have to revisit Muck in terms of the lower part for Chinook and its significance due to the prolonged run timing of our local Nisqually Chinook. Because the Green River run timing for the hatchery, Muck Creek is typically like dry at the mouth.
Yeah.
But Muck Creek, being a prairie system, has such a unique hydrology that it's responsible for our chum salmon being completely genetically unique to anything in Puget Sound. It's the latest, they're the latest returning chum on the Pacific Rim, and they're just totally different. It's also really significant to our steelhead life history too. And so in our steelhead recovery plan, Muck Creek is a super high priority, and we've actually been doing a lot of work on it to get a better handle on the hydrology and where the recharge areas are, and where, and getting it where the losing reaches, gaining reaches, all that stuff. And so, yeah, we have a whole nother Muck Creek presentation, but yeah, it's a pretty fascinating basin.
It really is. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Jeff, I remember that event really well. It was unfortunate, but you all did the right thing, and it prompted some change in the system and some significant restoration of that area. So that was a good call by the agency to do what you did. I did want to add a little genetics piece of this. You asked about the genetics in your first question. We're getting more and more results back over time, and we're getting a better sense of what this fish really is and what it isn't. The first year we got samples back, it appeared that this was very much a North Sound kind of Chinook, and we thought it was potentially from the Skagit. And I remember calling up my friend Lorraine Loomis and Scott Schuyler and thanking them for sending a few wild Chinook down to the Nisqually so we could start a population with something other than the Green River stock, which was really failing miserably. But as we've analyzed more genetic information over the last 5 years, we've learned that this is the most genetically distinct Chinook population in Puget Sound. So when WDFW or somebody takes a sample in Puget Sound and analyzes it, there's like a 99.4% chance if it's a Nisqually fish, they will identify it as a Nisqually fish. So it has a higher uniqueness than even the Skagit or the Elwha or the Nooksack. It's a really different fish. And for whatever reason, maybe the way the Nisqually interacts with the prairie systems and coming off the mountain and flowing north instead of south or west, all of our populations are genetically distinct. The pink, steelhead, chum, Chinook are all different and unique. And yeah, it's a really fascinating system that deserves more study.
David, Chris, follow up on that, your comment about the genetics. It clearly obviously went through a big bottleneck, this stock. And so do you have any concerns about the relative genetic diversity Or are you seeing that, no, we seem to be okay? Or do you have any?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we're when you look at the effective populations, you know, do the genetic fancy,
Right.
the magic, you know, the Harry Potter stuff on the genetics. It is a smaller population size currently, of just around like 200 fish. And that's through the genetic kind of family structure, right? And so what is a primary concern for us is that as we move forward to and we're working with Noah and others on this right now to put a plan in place to over time shift away from having Green River stock in the watershed at all in our hatcheries to tying in making it one stock that has a lot of natural influence. That really becomes a key piece that we improve the diversity in the family size instead of truncate it. And so, yeah, John, that's a really key consideration for everything we do moving forward, because it did get to a level at which it was teetering on the brink of being non-viable.
I guess is a takeaway message. Another takeaway from this is that robust monitoring and evaluation. I mean, really, your monitoring found this, right? Is that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep. And so if you hadn't done that, you wouldn't have known. You might have continued the supplementation when you didn't need to, and et cetera. So I guess it's just a big plug for, there's still a lot we need to learn.
Yeah, that's a great point, John. And not to be arrogant about what you think you know. And that's a challenge for all of us. We went down a path thinking we had a Green River stock and that's all we had. And we started down a particular journey with that stock. We stopped that journey. That didn't work. We did another journey by transporting adults into the watershed, thinking that was going to be the solution. We've made a lot of mistakes. And the key to this is being able to admit it. And it's certainly easier to admit when you've got this gem that we found that's going to rescue us. But yeah, being open to being wrong is really critical in this effort. And your point about your first question around the diversity issue, it looks like the population got down below 20-ish adults, probably in the 70s or so. And so what we've seen is an increase in abundance, a pretty significant, rapid increase in abundance with the habitat restoration. I mean, it's taken some time, but from the fish's perspective, not that much time. And so that VSP parameter seems to be able to rebound quickly. I think that the diversity component of VSP is going to take a lot longer for it to rebound.
I'm zooming at home, and so I'm also Amy Fenlon from the Wildcat Steelhead Club. I'm a fisherman, so I am very excited to hear what's going on down there. I'm part of the council here, but it seems like a lot of focus has been on land restoration. And my sense is that bringing back the fish is going to have to do with emulating nature, and that you were able to catch this on the brink that nature couldn't recover if we kind of got out of her way. So my question is, in your restoration, did you tune into the biomass, what was going on in the river, the insect life, the things they're going to have to feed the system? And the reason I ask you this is that when I used to come up and fish on the Skagit River, my husband and I would notice the hatches going on. We had a great bald eagle festival that went on in the wintertime because the fish were there, and the eagles were eating the fish and then certainly dropping the carcasses back into the river. So the eagles have now gone. They don't come back anymore up the Skagit. So our whole system is really out of whack. And so I'm curious how to help and how to help our county begin to figure out what do we need to be doing differently? I mean, certainly we've had some increased runs, but I don't hear a lot of data on the biomass in the rivers or what's happening with our hatches, all the integrated parts that are need for the fish. So I'd love to hear your experience. Thank you.
Yeah, Amy and Chris, maybe I'll take a stab at this one to start with. That's a great question and a great observation. We've been using a lot of science to drive what we've been doing in the Nisqually. And so we've set up a hypothesis, what we think is going to happen, and then go out and monitor it and see if that actually happens. And we knew we had to do it for Chinook salmon because of the listing in 1999. We had an obligation to recover a Chinook population. And so based on the science, we knew what to do and where to do it and how to do it. And a lot of it has just simply been protecting what's already functioning in good shape. But restoring the estuary back to connection to Puget Sound and to the Nisqually River was the biggest thing that we've done that I think has had the biggest impact on these fish. And doing the habitat stuff is really important, but then sort of stepping back and let the fish tell you if it's working or not is really, really important. And we've invested a lot of time and energy, Chris's crew and staff, for 25 or 30 years in analyzing and monitoring to see what's going on. The other piece of this I would suggest for everybody is that it has to be an integrated approach. And so we've talked about the Green River hatchery population, and we're moving away from it, and it'll likely be out of the watershed soon. And then we'll develop a science-based program using these Nisqually wild fish. So we're going to integrate the hatcheries into the recovery objective. And the other piece of that is to integrate harvest into it as well. And we operate, as far as I know, the only mark selective terminal area treaty fishery in the world, where our fishermen go out and intentionally catch adipose clipped hatchery fish and release wild fish. And we thought this was going to be a really difficult thing to sell to our fishermen. But when they had an opportunity to release these Nisqually, local Nisqually fish that their dad's dad caught, they were excited about it. They posted all over social media. They love being able to touch these fish and let them go and know that they're going to come back and give them another opportunity. And for a fisherman, I mean, these are 25 and 30 and 40-pound fish. These are $100 bills. And they're letting them swim off happily because they see that connection to their culture and to their past. And so integrating the harvest and the hatcheries with the habitat restoration and letting the fish tell you when it's doing well is really the key to all of this. And you all are doing great work in the Skagit along those lines. A lot of what we're doing has been modeled after what you're doing. So it's great to be talking to a sister watershed that thinks along the same lines. The lesson that we learned is patience. It took 40 years to find this fish, to see a difference. And it's going to take that long to see additional changes and differences over time.
Maybe I missed this, but do you have a pink run in the Nisqually? And has that changed over time in the same way that pink runs have changed in other rivers? And do you see any covariance between the Chinook and either the earlier Chinook run that's supported by the hatchery or this other run? And then secondly, is there any indication that southern resident killer whales may be tracking these big fish into South Puget Sound yet?
I can do, Chris, you want to do the pink one? I'll do the southern resident killer whale one.
Yeah, sure. Yes, we do have a pink run, and it is actually it's the southernmost pink run in Puget Sound, and it's also genetically unique, which is just something that shows up. I think must have been something to do with the glacier receding, where Nisqually became opened up first out of all the mid and stuff. I don't know. There's some kind of really cool, biogeography going on. But yeah, so we have the pink run. It actually, when I first started, we were talking about putting a pink recovery plan together because they were not coming back. We were only getting a couple thousand, and pinks really to thrive need to come back in mass. And lately, though, we have been seeing a pretty decent bounce back in pinks. And to Amy's point about feeding the ecosystem, That's where I really think these large chum can do it, although chum have been depressed lately, but pinks are great for feeding the ecosystem and getting the eagles back. And they need to be embraced for that, for sure. Where, like, don't be shy about having massive escapements that are over capacity, because it's great for the ecosystem for the long term as well. Yeah, so we have pinks, Jacques, and they're unique. We don't have enough resolution yet in the long-term tracking of this Chinook with our pinks to see if there's any kind of like correlation or synchronicity or asynchronicity or not. We just don't have enough data points yet to make that.
And the preseason forecast this year, Jacques, is for 1.5 million pinks in the Nisqually. It's massive, absolutely massive. In terms of the SRKWs, there's the population of these local Nisqually fish is 3,000 or 4,000 fish swimming in Puget Sound. Maybe 2,500, 3,000 when they get back to the river. We're just now moving it into the coastwide genetic database so that when samples are taken in fisheries in Alaska and Canada and whale poop samples being taken, they'll be able to identify whether or not Nisqually Chinook are in those various harvest areas. I don't know that there's enough numbers yet in South Sound to attract the southern residents to come south. We've seen them come south for chum. We've seen them in the Chambers area around Stillicum. I've seen them out of my window. And the transients go all the way down into deep South Sound and will feed on the marine mammals. But the SRKWs don't seem to be coming this far south for Chinook yet.
Jeff has a question online.
Who does? Jeff?
Jeff, yeah.
Hey, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I see that, Jeff. So he's asking whether or not we should consider using Nisqually for repopulating a Deschutes program. And that's going to be a director after me, after Chris, and another director after that to wrestle with that one. We've got a long way to go before our fish are in the position where we're really willing and able to move them to other basins. I'm not aware, Chris, you would know better than I, but I'm not aware of there being a natal population in the Deschutes because of the falls.
There isn't.
There, right. And the Squaxin tribe for years has objected to establishing one because they were worried about what your previous agency would think about that. And so there's some political obstacles to overcome and some biological obstacles to overcome. But it's not impossible to think one day that may happen.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, one last quick question. Was there did you see a big bump in Chinook returns this last year since it was so good for others? I'm just curious if you saw, or do you have the numbers yet?
Chris, do you know?
Yeah, so we did actually, and what was really cool, because we're aware of this fish, and well, this isn't that cool, but we had really low flows. But in a glacier system, that's really what's prevented us from seeing these fish also until we changed our escapement methodologies. We have a glacial system, which is incredibly hard to see anything in. And so this year it was actually stayed pretty low and pretty clear for a long time. And we were seeing live local Nisqually Chinook spawning well into December, which is months later than the last of the Green River stock would spawn. And so just that component of their really protracted run timing and spawn timing is really different. And being able to see that now and observe it and has been really fascinating. And yeah, we did see a good push of them this year for sure.
All right, thanks.
Hey, John,
again.
I have one last question for those
Oh,
guys,
sure.
if possible.
Yeah.
Do you, maybe you mentioned this in your talk, have you tracked a difference in timing of when these late fall run Chinook migrate out of the system? Have you been able to
that's a
see that?
good point, Jacques. So we have they're later. So on the smolt trap, it's pretty much a bimodal curve. We have the early migrants and then a later par migrants, and those fish are rearing in the in the river for a time before then going to the estuary. And we don't have a good representation from that early fry piece yet, just because we haven't processed those. But for the par, the later par are almost 100% local Nisqually Chinook on that curve, and then the earlier piece of the par are were the Green River Drive fish that were largely offspring of the fish we supplemented. And so the information we really have from the out migration is also from those years that we were actively putting Green River fish on the spawning grounds. And so now we're trying to now go into a period of characterizing what the local Nisqually fish are doing under normal, like natural conditions, without us supplementing with Green River fish on the spawning grounds, and then what that smolt trap, what out migrant curve actually looks like, and the timing. And we'll be sampling fish in the estuary now and getting a better handle on their life history diversity and the life history patterns that they go through as juveniles and the habitats they use.
Cool. Great talk. Thanks.